Hey everyone, welcome back. Today
Yeah.
we're tackling something that I think a lot of you can relate to, even if you haven't lived it yourself. That feeling of being the new kid on the block, but magnify that times like 1,000. We're talking about the challenges that foreign students in Japan face.
Yeah, absolutely.
You send us this really interesting podcast snippet, and it got us thinking like, wow, there's a whole world of experiences out there that we don't always get to hear about. And it's right up our alley, right? Like diving deep into these stories.
Yeah, for sure. It's fascinating.
So listeners, we're going to break it all down for you today, right here in our little deep dive.
Let's do it. Okay, so the podcast snippet you sent us, it hones in on something that I think is kind of an obvious hurdle, but it's worth really exploring. Language. You're going to a new country, you're trying to study, make friends, just do life, but there's this wall of language, right? Like, how does that impact a student's experience beyond just like the classroom?
Right, yeah. You hit the nail on the head with that, the beyond the classroom part. Because sure, you're struggling to grasp the nuances of, say, ancient Japanese literature, but then you're also trying to order a coffee or ask for directions or even figure out, like, the laundry machine. Everything becomes this puzzle, this potential point of misunderstanding.
Oh, I bet. And it's constant.
Exactly. And that's where it can get really isolating, Like all of us, we thrive on connection, especially in a new environment.
Totally. It's like, how are you supposed to build a support network, find your people, when you can't even decipher the simplest interactions? It just compounds that feeling of being an outsider.
Yeah, definitely.
And this actually connects to something else the podcast touched on, like making friends, finding your crowd. We've all been there, feeling awkward trying to break into existing friend groups.
Oh, yeah. Like starting a new school or job, it's always a little.
Exactly. But now layer on cultural differences, maybe some homesickness, and a language barrier. It's a lot.
It's a whole other level of social navigation.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the language barrier, we've got the social side of things, but then there's the actual education system. And I know the podcast mentioned something about different expectations.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like students coming from different academic backgrounds, they might be in for a bit of a culture shock, too.
So, like, give us an example. What are some of those different expectations?
Okay, so imagine this. You're used to a system where class participation is super important. Like you're graded on speaking up, debating, that whole thing.
Right, totally.
But in some Japanese universities, that's not really the case. Like quiet attentiveness, that's often seen as a sign of respect. And participation, it might not even factor into your grade. Or if it does, it's minimal compared to a big final exam.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a completely different way of thinking about it.
Right, it's a whole different ballgame. And that can be a real adjustment for students who are used to, being more vocal in class.
Absolutely. So you're not just adapting to a new language, a new culture. You're adapting to a whole new way of learning.
Exactly.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the financial pressure that I'm sure a lot of these students are under, right? Like tuition, living expenses, that's stressful no matter where you are.
Yeah, for sure. That's a whole other layer of complexity.
Okay, so it sounds pretty daunting, right? But, the podcast did have a glimmer of optimism, right? Like they were talking about how there are more and more English programs popping up, more support services for foreign students. Like, what do you think? Is that just a trend or is there a real shift happening in Japanese education?
I think it's definitely more than just a trend. Like Japan's economy, its society, it's becoming more and more globalized, right?
Right.
And that means they need people with global skills, global perspectives.
Makes sense.
So attracting international students, it's not just about, being nice. It's about staying competitive, staying relevant on the world stage. So yeah, I do think there's a real push for change, a recognition that diversity is valuable. But, and this is important, it can't just be about, increasing the numbers. True integration, it requires effort from both sides.
Right. Like it takes two to tango.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about creating an environment where those students feel not just tolerated, but truly welcomed, supported.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really resonated with me from the podcast, that idea of it's not just about the students adapting, it's about us, the universities, the communities adapting too. And that whole idea of community, that's huge, right? Like finding your tribe, whether you're a student, a new hire, whatever, that feeling of belonging, it makes all the difference.
Totally. It's everything. And it makes you think, right? Like, what are we gaining, not just as a society, but on a human level when we welcome these students from all over? Think about the perspectives they bring, the experiences, the ideas. It enriches all of us when we open ourselves up to that kind of exchange. you know?
Absolutely. And that's something for all of us to think about, right? Like, how can we, in our own spheres of influence, be more welcoming, more inclusive, more open to the richness that diversity brings? And on that note, listeners, we'll leave you with that food for thought. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And until next time, keep those questions coming.
Yeah, keep them coming. This is fun.